Shawtuck Asylum, written by Richard McCrohan, narrated by Skylar Morgan. Prologue. Shawtuck Asylum. During the 19th century, the medical care and institutionalization of the mentally ill had not much changed since they stopped thinking of the mentally ill as being possessed by demons in the Middle Ages. In the United States, as in Europe, family members afflicted with a mental disease such as schizophrenia, psychosis, or even retardation and depression would be taken care of at home, which usually meant being shut into an attic room and hidden out of sight from other respectable people. The less controllable would be shoved out the door, where they would wind up in prisons, almshouses, or madhouses. It wasn't really until 1840 when social activist Dorothea Dix advocated for a more humane treatment of the mentally disabled that insane asylums began to be built to house the insane. Although that first step was to be admired, unfortunately, the proper treatment of mental disease was not really known. Metal cages, punishments and beatings, shackles and restraints, ice water baths, electroshock therapy, and frontal lobotomies were the normal treatment for the more uncontrollable in their cases. There were others later in the century who tried to change that form of warehousing and treatment, albeit usually for a more wealthy clientele. In 1859, Dr. Robert J. Mellecourt wanted to use some of the newer theories of mental health treatment that he had been studying. Dr. Mellecourt was the scion of a wealthy Connecticut family and had been studying abroad in Vienna. With his family's blessing and money, Dr. Mellecourt was able to convince the state government officials in New York to share in the funding of a state-of-the-art insane asylum in their state. They, in turn, also used federal monies to make this happen there. The governor and his aides chose poor, rural Delaware County for the location of this asylum. Most of that area included the Catskill Mountain region of the Appalachian Mountain Range, near the Pennsylvania border. It also included Shawtuck Mountain State Land Reserve. The federal monies involved there were able to build this on state-owned land. The powers that be were hoping that the endeavor would bring much-needed money and employment to the mostly dirt-poor residents of the county. They would be able to pump up the state coffers and at the same time point proudly to an institution that, although purposefully tucked away out of sight on state land, would bring well-needed prestige to the state. Hiring a family friend, Horatio Spencer, an architect trained in Europe also, to design the asylum, they both went over the top and came up with the huge, Victorian, Gothic, overly designed monstrosity that fit perfectly with both of their overindulged egos. Dr. Mellecourt was actually a good man who wanted a facility that would embody the new Kirkbride plan of treatment that was now coming into vogue. This building would be his legacy. Once opened, the Shawtuck Lunatic Asylum drew the best doctors from all over the world. This perceived mental health utopia catered to a mostly well-heeled clientele, hoping for the very best treatment for their unfortunate loved ones. None other than the world-famous Dr. Ludwig Hammendinger from Vienna, who had trained with Johannes Muller, and Dr. Emmett Heller of Philadelphia, elected to practice here and brought their staff. Part of the huge building was made into suites for the most prestigious doctors there, including Dr. Mellecourt himself. But because of the state's insistence on a more remote location for what they termed their madhouse, the first crack in Dr. Mellencourt's meticulous plan started. All of the additional doctors, nurses, attendants, orderlies, and staff were all from out of state and traveled to Shawtuck so they would be able to work with the best doctors in the world. Poor, rural Delaware County had no lodging for the day and night staff to live in. It was sparsely populated, consisting mostly of poor subsistence farmers or dairy farms. The county seat of Pickford, at that time, was really only a small collection of stores catering to the locals. The good doctor had to use some of his own money to build a series of small homes for his workers to live in. So intent on the look of his asylum, he never fully realized that the pristine forest parkland was out in the middle of nowhere. For the first 10 years of this Tony experiment in modern healthcare, things went as planned. Keeping qualified nurses and orderlies was always a bit of a problem because no one really wanted to live in the rural isolation, but nonetheless, they always found others of their ilk. Dr. Melicourt's legacy was soon to change, though. It really wasn't only one thing that led to his downfall, but rather several things happening simultaneously. Although everyone agreed that the beginning of the end started with the murder of a young staff doctor in 1868. The Civil War had ended 3 years previously, and an influx of soldiers suffering from what we now know today to be PTSD had flooded the system. No one then knew about the trauma of war on the young minds of the soldiers fighting it. War was still referred to as the splendid great game. The Civil War was considered the first modern war that was fought. Unfortunately, the modern part came from the advanced weaponry that was used, not from the centuries-old military tactics that were still being employed to wage war. The 100-year-old flintlock smoothbore rifles used during the American Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars in Europe were notoriously inaccurate after 20 feet. That was the reason why armies would form into long lines that stood directly across from the enemy and fire away. But the new rifled barrels now used, along with more accurate artillery and their deadly use of canister shot, brought the death toll in this type of fighting into the catastrophic range. More lives were lost and young men maimed in the Civil War than all of the U.S. casualties in all of the other wars combined. The horrendous carnage was on a scale unimaginable. Even the state of medical knowledge in battlefield hospitals was woefully inadequate to protect the wounded. A leg or arm wound usually meant instant amputation, neither without anesthesia nor in sterile conditions. Fatal infections and gangrene were the norm. A wound was usually a death sentence. Now, these soldiers were back home, and many couldn't adapt. The state officials saw this as a good way to bring additional revenue to the state and coerced Dr. Melicourt to take in the trauma-stricken ex-soldiers. Hence, Shawtuck Asylum received more than its share of new inmates and was ill-prepared to deal with them. When this happened and the staff became overwhelmed, the poor lodging situation again reared its ugly head. The high-quality caregivers used to dealing with a moneyed and more refined clientele were now faced with battle-hardened psychotics. This led to a growing stream of nurses and staff members leaving. Now faced with a massive human resources crisis, Dr. Melicourt took the state officials' advice and began hiring from the local population that was available. As the loss of the lower rungs of the staff positions were now being filled with the formerly unemployed, and for the most part illiterate locals, this drastic reduction of qualified people proved an impasse that couldn't be ignored. While the original staff coped the best they could for the privilege of working in the prestigious hospital, the addition of these low-paid, uneducated aides and orderlies proved too much to take. The trickle of turnovers became a flood. When Dr. Melicourt appealed to the state for more money to rectify the situation, he was astonished to find that the government largesse was no longer there to provide the needed funds. The newly elected governor felt that they had sunk enough money into the project and was now looking to reap the rewards of their effort. Seeing a way to lower the state unemployment list, he saw local workers as a way to do it. While there were many employed in rural Delaware County, these were primarily poor, uneducated, and unskilled in anything the hospital needed. No one was really equipped or even wanted to deal with the inmates. Most of these new and unsuitable candidates really had no idea of what they were actually signing up for. Whether through ignorance or indifference, or both, the new staff considered themselves almost like prison guards. They proved to be almost untrainable, and trouble soon began. This degradation of staff quality soon led to trouble between the highly skilled doctors and nurses who had first arrived and their new underlings. They appealed to Dr. Melicourt, but to no avail, as he himself was helpless to do anything. Dr. Hammendinger was the first notable doctor to leave in early 1867. In the summer of 1868, an asylum inmate was being prepped for a procedure when he suddenly broke free and stabbed a staff doctor, killing him. This led to a mass exodus of the rest of the illustrious named doctors, including Dr. Emmett Heller. With them gone, the well-heeled donors and families soon took their money and family members and left. Mostly all of the first-rate nurses and staff members left with them. Dr. Melicourt tried to do what he could, but it was all to no avail. Finally, by 1870, he admitted defeat. His dreams shattered and his reputation completely ruined, Dr. Melicourt committed suicide by hanging himself in his asylum office. The state then took over the running of the asylum. It now became just a place to warehouse the mentally unstable. As the years progressed, a series of doctors were put in charge of running the institution, each one increasingly less capable than the last. There were already stories circulating and rumors of abuse, murder, torture, medical experiments, and worse, coming from the locals who worked there. Now stuck with this white elephant, the state had secretly found a very lucrative venue in using Shawtuck Asylum to house the inmates from other hospitals and asylums that were deemed too unmanageable or too violent and considered irredeemable and incurable. A large premium was charged to take these unwanted patients off their hands, and most other hospitals were all too eager to pay it. The once esteemed hospital had turned from pillar to pariah, and by the turn of the century, the facility was renamed the Shawtuck Asylum for the criminally insane. During this time, the infamous Dr. Henry Cotton oversaw the asylum before moving on to his notorious reign at the Trenton Psychiatric Hospital in New Jersey. In 1918, a doctor by the name of Calvin Shockley came to head the institution. Dr. Shockley's main interest was in eugenics. He was part of the staff of the infamous Station for Environmental Evolution, located in Cold Spring Harbor, Long Island, in 1914. Much work had been done there, weeding out what they deemed the morally and evolutionary undesirable elements of society through involuntary sterilization. Dr. Shockley intended to use Shawtuck to further his research and experiments. His cold and callous attitude toward the patients housed there, and his willingness to do whatever needed to be done, no matter how immoral, filtered down to the nurses, orderlies, and aides on staff. This hellhole was allowed to exist in the state until 1932, when a new Reform Party took charge in the state capital. A subsequent investigation soon unearthed thousands of cases of sterilization, improper medical experiments, and countless deaths. There were missing records, missing patients, and forged documents. When the cemetery on the grounds was searched and various plots exhumed, they found evidence of hundreds of bodies buried with no personal names or information. Sometimes several bodies were buried in one grave. Dr. Calvin Shockley was fired in disgrace, stripped of his medical license, and the asylum was once again renamed and revamped. But the damage was already done. They may have gotten rid of Dr. Shockley, but the same nurses and orderlies were still working there. Old habits die hard. The newly christened Shawtuck State Mental Hospital continued to operate until 1989, when after a series of inmate escapes occurred, the old stone asylum was finally shut down and the remaining patients shuttled off to other institutions. But no matter what bronze plaque adorned the front gates of the huge Gothic miscreation, it was always referred to as Shawtuck Asylum.